From the moment I heard 343's vision for Halo Infinite, I was hooked. For the now third game in the venerable franchise, the developers were striking out from the template set by Bungie, instead exploring a forgotten piece of Halo's initial makeup, an open, less strictly defined campaign. I had wanted this open level design from the series for some time. Halo Combat Evolved was the first true FPS game I played, and at the time I knew it was something special. Master Chief was a superhero within the shooter genre, whose mastery of combat made players feel as if no options were off the table. There was never the worry that the expected FPS ammo boxes or health kits could run dry, because a generous melee and energy shield system gave the Chief a fallback for getting back into the fray. There was a tool for every potential situation, and importantly, the level design encouraged more than one way to approach a problem. Bucking the trend of corridor shooters of the time, Halo embraced a natural, open-air layout for its outdoor areas. Outcroppings and forerunner structures were cover, high ground and rallying points to be exploited. These levels weren't just big, empty arenas, but sandboxes of combat potential. And unlike other shooters, vehicles could also become a more natural part of the action. This was something lightly inspired by multiplayer maps, but also Halo's roots as an RTS game. It's just, rather than an entire platoon to consider, the Master Chief was a one-man army. Combat Evolved's best level, the Silent Cartographer, is the game's best parts in microcosm. A big island with a central facility, there's more than one way for players to approach the main objective, and plenty of hidden areas to explore. All of these excursions are necessary to build up an armory that's then put to use venturing into the level's linear core. But in later games, open world excursions became less prevalent, as Bungie and then 343 found a knack for tight arena combat that punctuated corridor action. Although the games were still great, I did miss that undeveloped open world idea in Halo Combat Evolved. By becoming strict corridor and arena shooters, the number of options to deal with threats unfortunately dwindled. Although Halo had built an identity of great weapons balancing, a vibrant universe of lore, and extra modes to cater to everybody, its single-player content felt like a science fiction take on what the competition was now cribbing. Chief still felt super, but there were fewer opportunities to express that, at least in its main campaign. When 343 announced that they were going back to the design of that game for Halo Infinite's campaign and fully embracing an open world progression system, I was excited for how this would shake out. Questions surrounded exactly how this would land, but in the 20 years since Combat Evolved, the open world shooter has since come to fruition with Far Cry and its contemporaries. There was plenty in Ubisoft's shooter that 343 could use for inspiration, whilst of course leaning in on Halo's vehicles, squads and alien armies to keep its identity. It was time for combat to once again evolve. After a week of collecting every trinket, wrapping up its main plot and traversing every square foot of a brand new Halo world, I've come away with mixed feelings on Halo Infinite. This isn't because it's not the experience I dreamt of. After all, the reality of developing a game of this scope is always going to be compromised. As expected, Halo Infinite does suffer from many of the issues that have plagued other series that have gone open world. A lack of direction, dominant strategies, and even a repetition of assets. Lately, because it wasn't the first open world game, I'm more forgiving of these issues in Halo Infinite. However, something unique to Halo Infinite is what I'm uneasy about. In short, it can't quite commit to a new open world vision, and brings too much vestigial baggage. It's a Halo game that is, ironically, marred by being a Halo game. Halo Infinite was one of my favourite games of 2021, and my reason for making this video is more to talk about why the game has stuck with me despite the flaws of its open world campaign. To set expectations, I won't be touching on its free-to-play multiplayer suite. Unlike others, I'm more willing to forgive its Battle Pass woes, as Halo Infinite's multiplayer is the most fun I've had with the series since Halo 3, and is the most fun I've had on a PC despite being an awful competitive FPS player. For more expanded thoughts, I recommend a recent video by Wizardwat that sums up much of what I enjoy about it. As they are two separate beasts, I'd instead like to sum up the successes and shortcomings of its single player content. So, what is the campaign? Unlike a usual open world game, Halo Infinite's adventure is structured into chapters. This means that only a few chapters deal with its open world excursions, whilst others are traditionally linear Halo levels. Like those levels, each open world zone has one big objective to complete, usually venturing to a structure or point that transitions into a linear level. In between, there's a number of side activities that the Chief can complete. Rescuing Marines, destroying outposts and propaganda towers, taking out high value targets, taking over FOBs, or plundering for trinkets. Audio logs, skulls, structures, armor caches, or Spartan cores. Unlike the linear content, these activities can be completed in any order the player decides. As well as having intrinsic value for players, doing these activities have intentional and unexpected benefits. Spartan cores allow the players to upgrade a suite of equipment that can be deployed to give Master Chief an edge in combat or exploration. High value targets all have variant weapons to collect. FOBs act as fast travel points as well as allow the players to call in weapon and vehicle replenishments for free, whilst destroying towers and completing missions give players valor points which unlock weapons and vehicles to call in. Although enemies are always a constant threat, taking out their outposts does make travel through some areas easier, and saving Marines does give you a valuable squad that will follow and fight with you in the open world. Although the plot of the game concerns stopping a faction called Banish activating Zeta Halo, these excursions are more about rebuilding the UNSC presence on this new ring. Audio logs are how the game develops plot outside of cutscenes, and I do think they're a good inclusion for not pausing the open world gameplay. These excursions get players to engage with Halo Infinite's unique selling point: exploration. Zeta Halo is a vibrant biome of tall peaks, creeks, and alien structures that the developers have placed with care and attention. Every cave and potential hotspot is usually adorned with makeshift camps and weapon caches, each a bit of environmental storytelling that fleshes out the world. Climbing up a mountain and finding an old Forerunner structure or trinket is always exciting, especially when they're not pinged on a map or at the end of a big beacon. Roaming bands of Banished are frequent, as are vehicles to hijack, meaning that a fight and a way to turn it in the Chief's favour is never too far out. These are all in between the designed encounters of FOBs and outposts, and the linear Halo levels. Halo Combat Evolved used its large space to evoke a big alien world that could be properly exploited, and Halo Infinite, nearly 20 years later, is that idea properly realised. As I hoped for, the evolved combat of the first game is a perfect fit here. Every side activity isn't walled off, meaning that a player can approach from absolutely any direction, with any weapon in hand, and go to work. Unlike older games, a player can even cut their losses when a battle becomes too hot, and damaged structures and dead high value targets stay that way. The older Halo games left the player at the mercy of whatever weapons the Chief started off with and later found on the battlefield, often Covenant plasma rifles and alien technology. The further missions went on, the less likely a player might find a comfortable human weapon. The intent was to get players experimenting, but it ultimately made the Covenant weapons far too apparent and, ironically, less alien. Infinite eliminates this issue in two ways. Not only do the Banished scavenge whatever weapons they can find, including human weapons, but FOBs allow players to restock these items without question. The game still encourages players to cycle through items, of course, but having a comfortable solution to play with favourites is always appreciated, and averages out the number of human and Covenant weapons. Speaking of, the biggest improvement to this combat rhythm is the Chief's most important new ability, the grappling hook. This attachment is intentionally designed for entertaining on-foot exploration. Each sheer cliff and tall tree in the environment becomes a hook point for wannabe web slingers to shoot across the map without touching the ground. The grappling hook also makes scaling vertical obstacles possible, allowing players to get to places they usually shouldn't, either for sniping spots or recuperation. But the grappling hook comes to life during arena combat. Not only can the chief retract himself out of hectic situations, he can pull fresh weapons into his hands without losing an advantageous position, or stun lock an enemy and zip into punching range. If Halo combat is a flow diagram of melee, grenades, weapons and movement, the grappling hook plays well with almost all of them, and adds another layer of depth. The grappling hook is Halo Infinite's best idea, because not only does it uplift series traditions, but is a perfect fit for its new open world design. Returning vehicles also get a sense of purpose in this shift, especially flying vehicles. Ones power objects in the multiplayer and some campaign maps. Here they fully connect up all the disparate zones, meaning that players can return to previous areas and collect all those last few trinkets, as well as get to even stranger places the grappling hook can't. These elements of Halo finally get more room to breathe in an open world. My major criticism is in how the open world integrates with vestigial linear Halo levels. Because it doesn't. The joy of open world combat is that, if a player is overwhelmed, they can head to an FOB, restock on weapons, maybe get a vehicle, and turn the odds back in their favour. This system isn't possible in the linear levels, because they are completely disconnected from the open world. Like the old Halo games, the player is at the mercy of whatever weapons enemies are carrying and what few hiding spots there are to recoup and replan. Whenever the chief got killed in the open world, I was happy to shrug it off and either replan my attack or try another activity. The linear levels unfortunately are a grinder you're stuck in until you push through just enough. The benefit of these linear levels, of course, is that they can be paced and directed more sharply than a free-form open world, and they are where most of the game's plot is told. It's a shame because ultimately they make the open world activities feel less important. It means that the only meaningful upgrades to seek out are the Spartan cores, as that equipment will follow the chief indoors and out. You can't bring in saved marines, taking out high value targets doesn't demotivate enemies and structures, and you can't call in a replenishment of weapons. Being stuck in linear levels left me wanting for open world content. On the flip side, if a player isn't interested in engaging with optional activities and instead wants a more linear Halo experience, they'll be left with a game that is stuck in the same biomes without much meat to dig into. Although including Halo excursions like the ones from 2 onward was likely done to keep all fans happy, this split in design makes both halves incompatible. It makes the open world feel lesser, and the linear levels antiquated, rather than demonstrating what both do so well. Halo is at its best when elements mix, and it's a shame this didn't apply to level design. And yet, one part of Halo Infinite's campaign does brilliantly blend these two approaches. It begins when a pilot the chief has befriended is shot down by anti-aircraft guns. The player is then asked to deactivate the free gun so the pilot can escape. This enormous landmass has no set paths nor solid structures, so each gun can be tackled in any order a player wants. Kidnapped marines and audio logs are all within the main AA areas, meaning there's no dissonance of going off the beaten path to save them. However, things like Spartan cores and skulls are out there for the chief to seek out, just like weapon caches and vehicles to turn the tide in his favour. There's none of the meandering open world antics that plays uneasy with the plot, nor is there the issue of being stuck in a metal box that the linear levels have. This section even ends with a fun boss battle that, like every open world fight, can be exploited by thinking outside of the box. Stealing vehicles, high-powered weapons, and using the environment to bamboozle and blast them. Although I can't say I imagined a mission like this when I was told about an open world Halo, the AA mission is the one I'm still thinking of after finishing the game. Immersion elements like having the Marines help you fight back the Banish whilst you take out an AA, using a vehicle to run distraction, using a grappling hook on an AA to make distance and swing into enemies, they all brilliantly sum up all the great things Halo Infinite has going for it. But that's not all. A later linear level manages to flip expectations with open design. When the chief finds himself locked inside an enormous Banish tower to save the pilot, he is put through a number of combat scenarios.
These small maps feel ripped right out of the multiplayer, containing hiding spots, verticality and structures to exploit. Human weapons are plentiful, as are enemies to fight. A one-man fire team mode that puts to the test all the things you learn in the open world, with the only limit being no outside world to return to. These two sections are a microcosm of Halo Infinite's best ideas, and are two sides of the same coin. Open but linear, linear but open.
Although these linear excursions are the biggest misstep of Halo Infinite's new design, there are some niggling issues with its open world. The game suffers many of the same problems of its contemporaries,
especially those that also made a first-time transition into the open world genre.
Metal Gear Solid 5 applied ideas from the Far Cry series to turn espionage action into tactical excursions. Unfortunately, it came at the cost of Metal Gear's trademark writing and pacing, and missions became less interesting the more powerful Big Boss became.
Despite an open world of opportunities, players would quickly gravitate towards non-lethal power weapons that played nicely with the game's scoring system and overall message of disarmament.
The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is one of the more successful examples of a shift to an open world, and yet still couldn't quite shake the dissonance between its open world activities and more linear excursions like the shrines and boss arenas. Halo Infinite's most direct comparison, funnily enough, might be Just Cause 3. Both are games about grappling hook wielding superheroes attempting to liberate a fantastical world. However, in the case of Just Cause 3, the linear missions never leave the open world, meaning that chaos can still be applied.
Unfortunately, those open world missions fall into the familiar rhythms of tailing, protecting and hunting that have become stock elsewhere.
Like Big Boss, grinding to unlock the best weapons does take a lot of choice out of Halo's combat, and happens so late in the game that it's unlikely you'll have anywhere to use them. Like Zelda, there's that lingering want for old elements to be better blended together. And whilst the grappling hook is great, it does make me wish the Chief also had a glider to complement it. In short, my issues with Halo Infinite, and the majority of open world games, come down to a single word: choice. Like Halo Combat Evolved and the Silent Cartographer, at its best, Halo Infinite is all about making choices. Do you go to the next big mission? Or do you explore the open world? Do you go on foot, in a Warthog or in a Wasp? Do you use a kinetic weapon? Or try out shock or plasma weapons? In the open world, the amount of choices a player has are, well, not quite infinite, but more than they could comprehend at once. In the early game, where power weapons can only be found in these combat scenarios, they're challenged to improvise. And it feels great, giving players the tools to figure it out, and then paying off when they do so successfully is how all games should work. It encourages exploration, not just of the open world, but Halo's mechanics. Linear levels don't have those kind of choices. There is only one direction to move, leaving players railroaded by the developer's intentions. And there's no room to improvise with enemy encounters. As stated, these linear levels make choices in the open world feel less meaningful, because, ultimately, they never contribute to the game's progression. The only reason to do these activities is, well, because of the enjoyment a player might derive out of them. Metal Gear Solid 5, Breath of the Wild and Just Cause 3 become far less interesting games when choices are taken out of the equation. Whether that's because a player has unlocked a weapon that negates using any others, or they're stuck in a shrine with limited resources, or they're being asked to behave themselves in the once open world. That's not to say that some artificial restrictions can't add a fun challenge. As stated, the AA gun mission and the indoor combat test are examples of limiting where a player can go, but they also don't limit how a player can approach combat in a way that the other indoor sections do. I think it's only fair to compare these examples to another Microsoft game that does understand the fun of the open world: Forza Horizon. Although it's a driving game instead of an action game, Forza is more than just racing. Every square inch of its open world is accessible, and every activity a player does, Whether it be a 3-lap race or hitting ramps at over 100 miles an hour contributes to progression. With that progression comes new toys to play with, cars with different specs, new races and activities. All the while, the game never gets away from what it's good at: driving. Perhaps Halo Infinite could have taken a similar approach. As I stated earlier, the open world activities paint a story of the Chief building up the UNSC on Zeta Halo, and perhaps this could have been what the game was about: a number of activities that helps build up a new military force, reducing threats, scavenging weapons, rescuing soldiers. Then, to bring in linear levels, at every few milestones this force attacks a banished stronghold, or wages a direct skirmish. The more work a player did beforehand, the easier or more interesting these missions become. Perhaps research finds shortcuts or goodies in the structure, or maybe soldiers join the Chief on these missions. Arguably, this could be grinding to take choices out of these missions, like grinding to get the best weapons for the open world, but that's why, like Forza, these have to be left to the player to choose. The question is then, was this experiment successful enough to be the template of where to go next? Or, as this game seems to struggle with, should Halo 7 look a little more like Halo 5? The familiar thrills of its multiplayer might spell that players are more likely to want a Halo campaign like what they remember. The blockbuster highs of Halo 2, 3 and Reach. Personally, I have a lot of fondness for this imperfect open world. Sure, it's a little big and looks a little samey, and many of the activities do start to blend together, yet having almost infinite approaches to problem solving is wonderful. Although it takes ideas from Far Cry and its contemporaries, it doesn't get bogged down in crafting nor levelling, meaning the Chief always feels as powerful as he did nearly 2 decades ago. My major issue with Halo Infinite's open world is that it's undercut by the other Halo inclusions. The game starts with 2 explosive action levels set on spaceships, only for the pace to come crashing down once the players enter the open world. Halo Combat Evolved did this same trick, to contrast a tutorial in a standard corridor shooter with an open world with endless possibilities. It works there because of the inbuilt stakes are never as high as they are in Halo Infinite, because Combat Evolved only asks players to explore, to find some missing Marines and establish an FOB. In Infinite, that stuff is secondary to solving its big, galaxy-threatening mystery. Although I have no influence on 343, I would hope that some of the scrapped ideas from production might make it into an expansion or second take on Halo Infinite. After all, many of this game's shortcomings are the unfortunate result of the developers not reaching their intended vision, so I can only hope that Infinite's success may open the door for that. Even if Halo does decide to close some of its walls in next time, I do hope that ideas like the grappling hook and levels like the anti-air gun excursion return.
The game, as it stands, isn't just playable, but it's easily the most fun I've had in a shooter campaign since Titanfall 2. It's worth its price of admission, especially on Game Pass, but it could still be improved a second time round.
Halo Infinite is a curious game that I genuinely enjoyed, but didn't love like I wanted to. Many of my highest expectations were checked very quickly, but even the game as it is now has room to improve. I think that's a great place to be, however. If things have turned out perfect, more of the same in a new Halo game would have been boring. Having a place to go from here has me excited for what 343 can do next, because the possibilities for the series really do seem infinite.